They said she was just another recruit, too quiet, too polished, the kind who didn't belong in a place built on shouting and sweat. That's what the sergeant said, smirking under the Carolina sun, clipboard tucked against his chest like authority itself. But he didn't know who he was talking to. Not yet. He didn't know that the woman standing at the end of that line, boots planted firm in the dust, had seen more combat than most of his entire company. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you still believe that respect shouldn't depend on rank or gender, go ahead and like and subscribe, because this one hits harder than anyone expected. It was training day at Camp Bristow, humidity thick enough to choke the patience out of anyone, the smell of iron and diesel hanging low over the field. Recruits lined up under the blinding noon light, eyes front, back straight. Some trembled under the weight of the sun and the barked orders. Others hid their fear behind bravado. But one woman, Jane Hayes, didn't flinch. Late 20s, calm, composed, the faintest scar tracing the edge of her left jaw like a memory she didn't talk about. She stood still, not with stiffness, but with control. The kind you learn when you've seen things that don't fit into stories. To them, she was a new face, a transfer from the reserve pool. To Sergeant Blake Rowan, she was a mistake in his formation, too confident, too unreadable, the kind that made him feel watched. "Recruit Hayes," he shouted, boots grinding into gravel as he stalked toward her. "You forget how to stand at attention?" His voice cracked like a whip across the lineup. The others held their breath, grateful it wasn't them. Jane didn't blink. "No, Sergeant," she said simply. Her tone wasn't disrespectful. It was measured, steady. That calm set him off. "You call that posture military?" he barked again, circling her like a wolf around something it didn't understand. "Straighten up, chin higher, or I'll make sure you're scrubbing the latrines till Christmas." She adjusted slightly, only slightly. Just enough to obey, not enough to cower. That was the problem. She didn't flinch when he expected fear. Didn't give him the small satisfaction that made men like Rowan feel powerful. He leaned closer. "You think this is a game, rookie?" he hissed, his breath hot with arrogance. "You think you're special?" She looked straight ahead and said quietly, "No, Sergeant. I think I'm prepared." It was the wrong answer for a man like him. The kind who measured respect by volume, not composure. The sound cracked across the field before anyone realized what had happened. His palm connected with her cheek, hard, sharp enough to turn heads all the way down the line. The slap echoed through the humid air, silencing every laugh, every whispered breath. The recruits froze, eyes wide, the world reduced to the space between his raised hand and her unmoved face. A few winced. One or two glanced toward the office windows, unsure if anyone had seen. But no one stepped in. No one ever did. Jane's head tilted slightly from the force, but her gaze never left the horizon. A faint red bloom spread across her cheek. She didn't cry, didn't curse, didn't crumble. Instead, she turned her eyes slowly back toward him, calm and focused, the way someone looks at a problem, not an enemy. "Permission to speak freely, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost too soft for the yard, but there was something in it that made even the wind hesitate. Rowan smirked, puffed his chest. "You said enough." Her jaw flexed once, but her expression never changed. "No," she said evenly. "You have." He frowned, thrown off by the confidence bleeding through her calm. Around them, recruits shifted uneasily, sensing something deeper unfolding, something outside their training manuals. Rowan straightened his cap, snapped his gaze away, and barked for the formation to continue. "Everyone drop. 50 push-ups for your buddy here for getting respect," he yelled, trying to drown the moment in routine. But the silence that followed wasn't obedience, it was disbelief. They hit the ground, palms to dirt, but their eyes kept flicking toward her. Jane lowered herself alongside them, dust rising with every push, her body steady, movements flawless. She didn't need pity. She didn't need defense. The quiet around her was enough. It was the kind of silence that carried its own authority, one that doesn't ask for attention, it commands it. Afterward, while the others trudged to the mess hall, Jane stayed behind, kneeling beside the line, retightening the strap on her boot. Her cheek was still pink, but her eyes were sharp, watchful. The medic on duty approached, nervous. "You okay, ma'am? I mean, recruit?" She gave a small nod. Fine. Then softer, almost to herself. It's always the loudest ones who break first. In the distance, Rowan was laughing with another sergeant, his voice echoing across the yard. These new recruits, soft as pudding, think they're equal soon as they put on a uniform. His buddy chuckled. You gave her the reality check she needed. Rowan smirked. She'll either quit or learn her place. He had no idea that by morning, his own place would be under review by people whose names weren't on any roster. That night, the base fell quiet. Only the hum of generators and the soft rhythm of boots on gravel broke the stillness. Inside her barracks, Jane sat on her bunk, a folder open on her lap. The papers inside bore seals few people outside the Pentagon had ever seen. She flipped through them once more, her fingers brushing over a photograph, a younger version of herself standing beside a squad of Special Forces operators, desert sand swirling behind them. Her eyes in the picture were the same as now, steady, unafraid, focused on something beyond what others could see. She closed the folder and slid it beneath her pillow, then took a breath and whispered under her breath. They always test the quiet ones first. Her voice held no anger, no pride, just certainty. Outside, lightning flashed faintly over the horizon, the start of a southern storm. By dawn, word of the slap had begun to trickle through the base, carried not by gossip, but by unease. Recruits whispered in the chow line. Officers pretended not to hear. Even Rowan felt it, a strange heaviness in the air, as if something unseen had shifted against him. He brushed it off, tightening his belt and shouting louder than usual, convincing himself authority was still his to wield. But when he reached the field, Jane was already there, standing at attention, uniform crisp, boots gleaming. Her face bore no trace of the previous day's humiliation, only quiet composure. He stopped mid-step, watching her, something in her bearing pulling at his instincts. She looked too professional, too deliberate. For the first time, he couldn't place her. "Morning, Sergeant," she said, tone polite but even. He opened his mouth to reply, but the sound of approaching engines cut him off. A convoy rolled through the gate. Black SUVs, no insignia, windows tinted. The recruits turned to watch. Rowan frowned, confused. The vehicle stopped near the command office, and from the lead car stepped a woman in full dress uniform. Her presence shifted the entire field into silence. Rowan squinted. Colonel's insignia. He snapped to attention. But the colonel didn't look at him. She looked at Jane. And that's when every soldier on that field realized the story they thought they understood was just beginning to unfold. And when it did, Camp Bristow would never forget her name. The convoy hadn't come for ceremony. It came for answers. By the time the engines cut and the doors opened, the morning heat had already turned heavy. Colonel Alicia Rhodes stepped out first, her boots hitting the ground with deliberate precision. The silver on her shoulders caught the light like a quiet warning. Behind her, 2 officers followed, both carrying sealed folders. Their faces were unreadable, not angry, not surprised, just focused. The kind of focus that usually came before someone's entire career was about to change. Sergeant Rowan stood at attention near the front of the field, sweat gathering under his collar. He didn't know why command had arrived unannounced, but his gut told him it wasn't good. He tried to stand taller, tried to look like a man who had everything under control. But as Colonel Rhodes' eyes swept over the formation, they didn't linger on him. They stopped on one person, Jane Hayes. "Recruit Hayes," the colonel said calmly, her voice cutting through the humid air. "Step forward." Every head turned. The formation parted slightly, the sound of boots shifting on gravel echoing through the silence. Jane stepped forward, her expression unchanged, her movements crisp and deliberate. When she stopped a few paces from the colonel, she saluted. "Ma'am." Rhodes returned the salute without hesitation. "At ease, Sergeant Hayes." The yard froze. No one moved, no one breathed. The word hung there, Sergeant. For a second, it didn't even register. Then confusion rippled through the ranks like static. Recruits glanced at one another, brows furrowing, realization dawning like slow thunder. Rowan blinked. "Ma'am?" he stammered before he could stop himself. "Did you say?" "Yes, Sergeant Rowan," Rhodes interrupted, her tone sharpening. "You heard me correctly. Sergeant First Class Jane Hayes, United States Army Special Forces, attached to Joint Task Command." A sound left Rowan's throat, part disbelief, part dread. He swallowed hard. I wasn't informed. You weren't supposed to be, she said. Her assignment here was covert. Observation of instructional methods, disciplinary conduct, and leadership integrity. The colonel's gaze shifted toward him like a weight. You were one of her primary subjects. The color drained from his face. Around him, recruits stood stiff, wide-eyed. Some looked at Jane with new awe, others with quiet guilt. Every one of them remembered the sound of that slap. Colonel Rhodes took a slow step closer to Rowan. Yesterday, at approximately 1,417 hours, you struck a subordinate under your command, without provocation or justification. You did so in front of witnesses, in violation of Articles 93 and 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Rowan's lips parted, desperate for an explanation that didn't exist. Ma'am, she was being insubordinate. She was doing her job, Rhodes snapped, voice steady but cold. And you were proving hers. She motioned to the officers behind her. One of them opened a folder, pulling out a still image, security footage from the training field. Even from a distance, the moment was unmistakable. His hand raised. Her head turned slightly. The entire yard frozen in shock. Rhodes didn't raise her voice, but every word struck like steel. You struck a Special Forces NCO undercover evaluation. You humiliated her in front of recruits and laughed about it afterward. You didn't just fail leadership, Sergeant Rowan. You demonstrated exactly why she was sent here in the first place. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the wind seemed to die out. Rowan's shoulders sank. His voice, when it came, was small. I didn't know who she was. That's the point, Rhodes said softly. You shouldn't need to. Jane hadn't spoken once. She stood still, not gloating, not angry, just steady. That calm unnerved everyone more than shouting ever could. When the colonel turned to her, Jane's eyes met hers with quiet respect. Sergeant Hayes, Rhodes said, you have anything to add? Jane paused, her gaze drifting briefly over the formation. The same recruits who had watched, silent, as she was struck. No, ma'am, she said finally. The footage says enough. Rhodes gave a short nod. Understood. You're dismissed for now, Sergeant. We'll debrief privately at 1400. Jane saluted and stepped back, returning to formation. The recruits' eyes followed her, their posture subtly changing, not out of fear, but reverence. A few straightened their backs instinctively, as though her composure demanded it of them. When Rhodes faced Rowan again, her tone softened, not with sympathy, but with the weight of truth. You've been in service long enough to know what respect means, Sergeant. You talk about discipline, but discipline without dignity is just control. And control isn't leadership. He didn't answer. There wasn't one that would help. Later that afternoon, the story spread through Camp Bristow like wildfire, though not through rumor. The command made no official announcement, but the truth needed no help traveling. Soldiers whispered in the mess hall, in the barracks, out by the motor pool. She's Special Forces. He hit her. The colonel came down herself. Instructors who had once laughed at Rowan's jokes now kept their distance. Recruits who had giggled the day before walked in silence when she passed. The base felt different, heavier, as if the ground itself remembered. Inside the admin building, Rowan sat alone in his small office. The blinds were half closed, the light slanting across his desk in narrow bars. He could still hear the echo of the colonel's words in his head. He hadn't meant to lose control, hadn't planned to, but somewhere deep down, he knew that wasn't the point. It wasn't about control. It was about how easily he had forgotten what it meant to earn respect rather than demand it. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. He looked up. Jane Hayes stood in the doorway, still in uniform, still composed. For a long second, neither spoke. Ma'am, he began, then stopped himself, correcting. Sergeant. She stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind her. Colonel Rhodes asked me to speak with you before the report is finalized, she said quietly. This isn't an appeal. Just clarity. He nodded, unsure what else to do. You don't need to apologize to me, she continued. But you should understand something. When you hit me, I wasn't angry. I was disappointed. Because I've spent years training men and women who lead under fire without ever raising a hand in anger. And to see it here, in a place that's supposed to teach discipline, it reminded me how easy it is to forget why we wear this. Rowan swallowed hard. You've been undercover here how long? 6 weeks, she said. Long enough to see what works and what doesn't. He nodded slowly, shame creeping through him. And what happens now? That's not for me to decide, she said. But I can tell you this, punishment won't fix it. Change will. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. You've got good soldiers under you. Show them you remember what that means. And then she was gone. Rowan sat for a long time after that, staring at the empty doorway, hearing the faint sound of drills outside, her voice among them now, giving instructions, calm and firm. No shouting, no threats, just presence. That evening, Colonel Rhodes held a quiet meeting in the operations hall. No audience, no ceremony, just a room of instructors and senior staff. Jane stood beside her as the colonel spoke. Discipline isn't about fear, Rhodes said, her voice carrying steady through the hall. It's about trust, and if we can't teach that, then we're building nothing worth following. She turned to Jane. Sergeant Hayes will remain on site for the duration of her assignment, but not as a recruit. Effective immediately, she'll serve as leadership advisor to this unit. There was no applause, no celebration, just understanding. Outside, the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in deep amber. The recruits gathered quietly by the barracks, some whispering, others just sitting in silence. For the first time in a long while, the base felt still, not out of fear, but reflection. And somewhere in that stillness, Sergeant Rowan stood alone near the edge of the field, watching Jane lead a small group through tactical drills. Her voice was calm, her movements precise. He realized then that the silence following her wasn't submission, it was respect. The kind he had spent years trying to demand and never truly earned. He exhaled slowly. The lesson had landed harder than any reprimand ever could. By the next morning, the air around Camp Bristow felt different. The shouting had quieted. The arrogance that used to hang over the training field like smoke had thinned, replaced by something steadier, watchfulness, humility. The kind that follows after a storm, when everyone realizes what they almost lost. The recruits moved with new discipline, but it wasn't fear guiding them anymore. It was the weight of example. And at the center of it all was Sergeant Jane Hayes, the woman who had been invisible one day and unforgettable the next. She stood at the edge of the yard as the sun climbed, clipboard in hand, watching a group of young soldiers run drills. There was no barked command, no raised voice. Just a simple call of instruction, low and even. Watch your spacing. Trust your partner. Discipline isn't about how loud you shout. It's how well you listen. The recruits nodded, moving tighter into formation. Her presence carried a quiet authority, and even the wind seemed to follow her cadence. Inside the command building, Sergeant Rowan stood before Colonel Rhodes' desk. His uniform was crisp, his posture disciplined, not from pride this time, but from respect. Rhodes looked up from her paperwork, her gaze level but not cold. "Sit down, Sergeant," she said. He did, carefully. "I won't waste your time," she began. "The investigation is complete. You're being reassigned, temporarily. Command believes in second chances, but not without reflection. You'll assist Sergeant Hayes for the remainder of her evaluation. You'll observe, learn, and rebuild what was lost. Do you understand?" Rowan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Rhodes studied him a moment longer, her tone softening. "You served a long time. That means something. Don't let one moment define you. Let what you do after it define you instead." He swallowed, his voice rough. Understood. When he stepped back into the daylight, it felt sharper somehow. The kind that exposes everything, every crack and shadow. Across the field, Jane was standing with a new class of recruits, her expression calm, focused. For a moment, he hesitated, then walked toward her. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, stopping a few feet away. She turned, acknowledging him with a small nod. "Colonel told me about the reassignment," he added. "I know," she said simply. "You ready to work?" He blinked, caught off guard by how normal her tone was. No accusation, no resentment. "Yes, Sergeant." "Good," she replied. "We start at 0600. I'll need you on logistics and field prep." "And Rowan?" "Yes." Her eyes met his, steady and direct. "Don't overcompensate trying to prove something. Just be better." He nodded. It was the only thing left to say. Over the next week, the base slowly adapted to the new rhythm. Jane led the morning briefings, emphasizing communication, empathy, accountability, words that once felt out of place in the barracks, but now carried weight. Rowan assisted quietly, no longer the loudest voice in the yard, but present, patient, listening. The recruits began to notice. They saw two leaders, one who had once ruled through fear, now learning from the one who led through respect. There was a moment, late one evening, when Rowan caught sight of Jane alone on the training field. The sky was purple with dusk, the air still. She stood at the firing range, ear protection resting around her neck, her eyes fixed on the distant targets. Her grouping was perfect, 10 rounds, all center mass. But she didn't look satisfied. She looked thoughtful. He approached slowly, not wanting to intrude. "You ever miss it?" he asked quietly. She lowered the weapon, exhaling. "The field? Yeah." She smiled faintly. "Every day? But not for the reasons you think. I miss the clarity. Out there, everything makes sense. You protect your team. You watch their backs. You don't question who deserves respect. You just give it." Rowan nodded slowly. "I lost that somewhere along the way." She glanced at him, her tone gentler now. "No, you just forgot it's a choice you make every day." They stood there for a while, the silence between them no longer heavy, just honest. By the end of her evaluation, Jane had become more than just an observer. She'd become a quiet turning point in the way the camp operated. Command noticed. Recruits noticed. Even Rowan noticed, most of all. The day she was set to leave, the entire unit gathered at the field without orders. It wasn't a ceremony. There were no flags, no speeches, just people showing up because they felt they should. Jane stepped forward, dressed in her Special Forces uniform now, the green beret tucked neatly under one arm. The sunlight caught the small medals on her chest, but her eyes were soft, almost reluctant to stand in the spotlight. Colonel Rhodes gave a brief nod. "Sergeant Hayes," she said, "your assessment report is complete. On behalf of Command, thank you for reminding this unit what leadership truly looks like." Jane shook her hand, then turned to face the formation. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched, respectful. Then she spoke. "You'll forget my name eventually," she began. "That's fine. Just don't forget what it stood for. Respect isn't a title, it's a habit. And the day you start believing you're owed it is the day you stop deserving it." Her eyes flicked to Rowan briefly. "We all fail that test sometimes. What matters is how we recover." Then she stepped back, saluted the formation, and started toward the gate. As she passed, the soldiers, one by one, raised their hands in return. No one shouted. No one cheered. Just a wave of silent, synchronized respect. Rowan watched her go, a lump forming in his throat he didn't expect. When she reached the edge of the yard, she turned once, gave him a small nod, not of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. And that, somehow, meant more. That evening, the camp was quiet again. The sun dipped low, casting the training field in gold. Rowan stood where she had once stood, watching the recruits file out. His reflection in the glass of the office window looked older somehow, not weaker, just wiser. In his pocket, he kept a folded note she had left on his desk that morning. 5 words written in her small, sharp handwriting. "Lead by silence, not volume." He read it again, then tucked it away carefully. The message was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened. Weeks later, the recruits still talked about the day the colonel arrived. But they didn't mention the slap anymore. They mentioned what came after, the change. The way their instructors spoke differently. The way the atmosphere shifted from pressure to purpose. And every time they asked who Jane Hayes really was, someone would shrug and say, "Doesn't matter who she was. Matters what she left behind." Because that was the truth of it. Leadership doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly, gets knocked down, and still stands taller than everyone who tried to diminish it. At Camp Bristow, they never put up a plaque or held a ceremony for her. But every new class of recruits now learns one simple rule on day 1. Respect everyone, because you never know who's teaching you. And somewhere far from the base, in another undisclosed location, Sergeant First Class Jane Hayes was already walking into her next assignment. Same calm stride, same quiet confidence. She didn't need them to remember her name. She just needed them to remember the lesson. Because strength isn't proven in how hard you hit. It's in how steady you stand when someone tries to break you. And at Camp Bristow, long after she was gone, that lesson still echoed every morning when the flag went up, and the silence that followed felt like something sacred.